Our next session, our lunch session, I am very pleased, we're in for a real treat, to introduce the moderator of the next session. The moderator of the next session is my good friend, Jeff Belisario, who is the Executive Director of the Bay Area Council Economic Institute. In that role, he supports a wide range of institute research through project management, research design, and analysis. His research interests lie at the intersection of community development and finance, and his past projects include analyses of Bay Area housing programs, public-private partnerships for infrastructure, and the economic impacts of transportation investments. Before joining the Bay Area Council Economic Institute, Jeff worked in Chicago in various portfolio management and investment analysis positions for John Hancock and State Farm. He holds a master's in public policy degree from the UC Berkeley Goldman School of Public Policy and a bachelor's in finance from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So with that, please join me in welcoming the moderator of our next session, Jeff Belisario.
Thanks so much, Mark. All right, you didn't come to hear me, though, so I'm going to be pretty quick here. It's my honor today to introduce our lunchtime keynote speaker, the mayor of Sacramento, Darrell Steinberg. If my math is right, Mayor, you're at about 25 years of elected public service. I was on Wikipedia last night. Does that checks out?
19, yes. Just kidding. No.
He was first elected to a seat on the Sacramento City Council, later held elected office in the State Assembly and the State Senate, becoming president of the Senate in 2008. During his tenure in the legislature, he championed economic development, education reform, building sustainable communities, and major investments in healthcare and education. He authored the Mental Health Services Act, the first of its kind in the nation that generates $2 billion per year for people in need. His commitment to improving mental health care has resulted in services that provide integrated health care to the homeless. In 2013, as a state senator, he authored SB 82, propelling a major statewide expansion of crisis beds and capacity. In 2015, he established a first-of-its-kind statewide organization, the Steinberg Institute, dedicated to raising the profile of quality mental health care as a critical public policy and civil rights issue. And in February of 2019, Governor Newsom appointed him to co-lead a new statewide commission on homelessness and supportive housing. As leader of California's Big City Mayors Coalition, he has successfully negotiated with both Governors Brown and Newsom to make unprecedented statewide commitments to addressing homelessness, commitments that have brought millions of dollars to Sacramento and other cities around the state. So with that, please welcome the mayor of Sacramento, Darrell Steinberg.
Hi. Oh, I thought we were.
All right.
Are we? Am I getting this? I thought we were doing question and answer.
Want to do a Q&A?
Whatever you want. I'm easy. What do you
guys decide. It's up to you.
let me give.
You can go for.
Give a mayor a microphone here. Okay. Jeff, thank you. I'm happy to take a few minutes and then be happy to turn this into a question. We'll come back to questions and answers. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to Stanford. I have long forgotten now, many decades after the fact, that I didn't get admitted to Stanford as an undergraduate. And I have forgotten it. I'm not bitter about it, and I've moved on. It's all true. I went to Cal, but I always have loved Stanford, always. And it's always a great honor to be here and to be able to share a few thoughts with you about this seemingly intractable problem known as homelessness in California, but throughout our country. I think it is important to note that while it's really bad and has gotten worse, the fact of the matter is that California, through these various interventions and funding streams that Jeff has mentioned a moment ago, has literally gotten tens of thousands of unsheltered people off the streets over the last 5 years. Homelessness is worse in my city of Sacramento. I face it every day. And yet, we now have 1,100 shelter beds a night. We, from a low 5 years ago of 100. And we have gotten in our city and county over 14,000 people from unsheltered status to permanent housing. Oh my God, we should be having a parade. But of course we're not. Because the inflow and the numbers of people who become unsheltered and homeless far outnumber and outstrip the numbers of people that we are able to get off the streets. And I just think it is important. I don't say that as an excuse or look what we've done, but just to recognize that the problem is multifaceted, not just in terms of why people are homeless and the various interventions that are required to get them off the streets, but why people become homeless in the first place. And if we don't spend as much time, attention, resources, and policy change on why people become homeless in the first place as we do on getting them off the streets, we're going to be missing what may be, if not more important, at least as important. And so why do people become homeless? Well, I know that drug addiction and mental health crisis is a significant factor. But we must start, and frankly, we must finish with the central tenet of the increase in homelessness, and that is poverty. People are living on the economic edge. Housing is unaffordable. Middle-class jobs don't pay enough. And whether it's the chicken or the egg, the economic circumstance and the fragile living cause people who are fragile to begin with to become sick, to abuse or use drugs. If we don't acknowledge that California is becoming a state of as they used to say, the rich and the poor, people who cannot make it, then we are also missing a central tenet. And I know I saw Jennifer Hernandez out here. Where is she? Over there. Who I worked with in the legislature. I know has made her, a lot of her career as a very strong and effective advocate around reforming our California environmental quality law. And I want to talk about that for a moment, but maybe in a bit of a broader context, because I've come to some unorthodox conclusions about what it's going to take to make a demonstrable difference. I don't think we're going to cure this problem. That isn't usually what a politician would say. We're not going to cure it. The numbers are large, and some people are going to choose to live out of sight in whatever way they choose. But I believe fundamentally that if we are going to make a visible and demonstrable difference for our communities, for the people who are suffering, but also for our business communities, our business corridors, and our neighborhoods, we have to recognize one fundamental missing piece, and that is the law is not on our side. What do I mean by that? Think about it for a moment. The law requires that our state and our local communities provide a free public education to every young person. And we require the state and our local communities to build, literally construct, public schools. It's so embedded in our culture, in our reality, and the way our society works that we don't even give it a second thought. Think about housing and mental health care for a moment. And I've experienced this now every single day as a local government official moving from the state level. Everything the state, everything the cities, everything that the counties are called upon to do to alleviate homelessness is voluntary and optional. It's voluntary and optional. There is no right to housing in California. There is no right to mental health care for the most needy among us. And even if you don't like the idea of an individual right because you worry that it is going to lead to a lot of unnecessary litigation from a business perspective, there is no legally enforceable obligation for government at any level to produce any amount of shelter, housing. There is no obligation to bring people indoors. There is no obligation to provide mental health care and treatment to the thousands of people who are talking to themselves living in squalor in various California cities. And so we say we care, and I believe that we do as good people. Californians care. But I want to say to you, I don't think we care enough. Because if we really cared, the law would reflect that caring and commitment. We would say that every individual has a legal right to housing that could be enforced by somebody to make the cities and the counties build faster, be more innovative when it comes to housing. Why the only affordable housing finance structure we know requires $600,000 to $700,000 to $800,000 to $1 million per unit to build a single unit of supportive housing, when there are manufactured housing products that I have seen that are state-of-the-art that people who aren't homeless would choose to live in because they're kind of cool, actually. But in the state that spawned the Silicon Valley, and we're right in the heart of it here now, we have not had a housing innovation revolution around the kind of housing that we could build much cheaper and much faster. And so we say we care, but when there's no legal obligation to actually produce any amount of housing, when there's no legal obligation to provide mental health care and treatment to people with the most severe disabilities, well then you're going to get what you're going to get, which is a lot of money, more money than we've ever had before. That's good. A lot of urging, a lot of efforts and desires for governmental jurisdictions which, on the natural fight with one another, cities and counties mostly, to actually try to get together and figure out how to devise a system that is more effective and efficient. But that's all voluntary as well. I want to give you a historic contrast for a moment because it really is meaningful to me. I have been involved in the mental health movement for a long time, and the Mental Health Services Act, just one slight correction, people making $1 million or more in California are doing really well, because the millionaire's tax for mental health that I passed in 2004 is not generating $2 billion. It's generating $3.8 billion a year. It's a lot of money. It all goes to the counties. Now, if I knew that I was going to run for mayor of Sacramento, but when I wrote it, I might have written it a little different. But that is a whole nother speech. But I want to give you a little bit of a historic contrast that is really meaningful to me. In 1977, a famous in his time legislator named Frank Landerman wrote the act that began closing the state's developmental centers, the centers for people with developmental disabilities, because the belief then and the belief now is that people with developmental disabilities, it used to be known as mental retardation. That's not the politically correct or the correct term. Now it's developmental disabilities. He wrote the law to say that when we shut those hospitals and when the people come into our communities, that they have a lifetime entitlement and a right to whatever it takes so that they can live independently in the community. And we have these systems now of regional developmental centers that do just that. And the state hospitals continue to close, and they will be an advent of the past. 1977. 10 years earlier, the same Frank Landerman wrote what is known as the Landerman-Petra Short Act. You might know it as the 5150 Act. When they wrote that bill, they said two things. Well, they said one thing. They said that 90% of the savings from the closure of the state hospitals would flow to the communities to build a better system of community mental health care. Never happened. Now, Prop 63, $3.8 billion is a pretty good down payment, but it never happened. But there was one other fact, and if you remember nothing else about my speech today, please remember this. The legislature did not grant any kind of right or entitlement for people living with severe mental illness to get the care and treatment that they needed. They did it for the developmentally disabled, and rightfully so. They did not do it for the mentally ill. So you see somebody, try not to be graphic, unkempt, unclothed, talking to themselves, and ask yourself, is there any obligation for this society to provide care and treatment to that individual? And the answer is no. And that has to change. Now let me take it, I want to go back to my friend Jennifer Hernandez here for a moment, because let's take this from a regulatory reform perspective for just a moment, okay? How do we, because you talk a lot about CEQA and you've talked a lot about, I want you to think about this for a moment. If there was a right to housing in California, a legal right to housing that could be enforceable, here's, in my view, what would change. Pretend that I have a piece of paper in front of me, 8.5 by 11. I'm drawing a line down the middle of the paper. On the right-hand side are obstacles to building more housing. On the left-hand side are obligations to build housing. The right-hand side is a long, long list. Oh my God, it's CEQA, it's excessive regulation, it's high cost. It is lack of available resources. It's lack of housing innovation, as I spoke about earlier. Why we don't have a manufactured housing revolution in this state, I don't know, but we must. That list is long. On the left-hand side, you have nothing. You have a housing element law, which, to the governor's credit, he's trying to strengthen, which, yes, requires cities and counties to plan for housing, And I believe in the planning process. That's really, really important. But it is different than a production standard. It is different from compelling the actual production and placement standards. Oh, by the way, on the right-hand side as well, I should say, God, I maybe left out a really important one, and that is NIMBY, not in my backyard. So here's my belief, after doing this work for a long time. If you had a legally enforceable right to housing, all of those obstacles on the right-hand side of the page would not be as strong as they are now today. Because the legislature, local governments would have to find a way to overcome the impediments. And right now they don't. The default is to say no. A neighborhood complains, an interest group complains, it's too costly, you haven't figured out how to cut the cost, all of it. Where is the counterbalance? The law must be the counterbalance. And so where do we go from here? Governor Newsom, I think, has presented an opportunity that, if it is not yet seen in this way, I hope it will be seen in this way soon. And that is this idea of care courts. And I don't know if you've talked about it here today. It's a bill that is authored by Senators Eggman and Umberg on the Senate side, administration-sponsored bill that would allow a wide variety of people, including family members, and we're talking about homelessness now, family members, to be able to file a petition saying that their loved one or a city social worker or a county social worker to say that the person on the street needs help. And it would allow that person to be brought before a judge, and for a judge to rely on the advice of what they call a care courts treatment team, and to be able to define a treatment plan for the individual, and then, key point, allow the court to order the treatment plan. It's controversial because everybody's focused on what they usually focus on, which is the obligation of the individual to participate in their treatment plan. That's the involuntary commitment piece. And that's a reasonable and important debate. And frankly, I believe that the 5150 law should be reformed, and that if somebody is genuinely gravely disabled and can't care for themselves, and I'm sorry, it's not a civil right to be out on the street. And we need it. Everyone needs to be indoors. That's my view. But the real import of that bill, if it's done right, is it will obligate the government to actually provide the care and the treatment and the housing, which they're currently not obligated to do. Now, it's going through the legislature, and I worked there for 14 years, and let's just say, well, I'll put it without being snarky about it. Sometimes the balancing of the interests, which is necessary, becomes the paramount goal to get the bill done, that when the interests are balanced, in the end, the bill itself doesn't do anything that's very meaningful. And so I'm hopeful that that isn't the case, because I know the governor's very committed to it, the legislature, the lead legislators are committed to it, and that we get a tool which begins to open the window into a right to housing and a right to mental health treatment. I'd be happy to answer your questions. Thank you for having me.
Grab a seat.
Bless you. Where am I?
Whichever one you want.
I'm
That
right
one
here,
feels good?
the hot seat. Okay.
That was fantastic. I was going through my list of questions, and I think you've already answered all of them. So I'm going to give you just one, and then we'll go to the audience.
I'm sorry, okay.
It was perfect.
It's for me.
You're having a conversation in Sacramento right now about shelters.
Yes.
We haven't talked a lot about shelter here today, but when we talk about homelessness, we often find there's a group that says we need to clean up the streets, build shelters. There's another group that says we need the permanent solution, we need housing. Obviously, we need both. But how do you think about shelters in Sacramento, and how do you think about that being a bridge to permanent housing as opposed to a New York model where you're in a shelter?
So I do think we need, obviously, a variety of options depending on the person's needs and their acuity, whether or not they can want to and can live in a shelter, whether they need autonomy. And it's not exactly a false choice, but it's kind of a false choice. And your question is totally appropriate because it gets asked all the time. But when that's the question, we're already starting from, kind of a lose-lose. If there's an intersection, for me, it is this tiny home manufactured housing movement, because that presents the opportunity for autonomy and can be transitional or temporary, but could also serve as a longer-term housing for people. But, here's the problem. The federal tax credit, the tax credits, state tax credits, the federal HUD regulations, they don't support this kind of, in most instances, they don't support this kind of innovation, right? If it's got to have a 30-year useful life in order to qualify for the various forms of state and federal financing. And I go, really? I would settle for 10. You could guarantee somebody 10 years of housing? Shelter, though, I think gets a little bit of a bad name here, because the thing about shelter is that it does allow you to help larger numbers of people at one time at least begin the process of getting off the street. Friend here, Volunteers of America, do a great job around using shelter, not just as a place for people to lie their head and get out of the elements. That's good enough. Well, maybe it's not good enough, but it's important. But they also use the shelter as triage, to be able to begin to find out what the person needs, and then to help navigate them as quickly as possible when it's available to other more transitional or permanent housing. And I'll tell you this, the thing that drives me crazy about this debate is this. We all agree you cannot help somebody who's living on the riverbank, period, end of story. We can't get to them as much. So if I say it's a right to shelter, and you say it's a right to housing, tomato, tomato, I don't care what we call it. I want a legal right and a legal obligation to get people indoors and in any way help them begin their transition to a better life. That's all that matters.
Great, Fantastic. Let's go to the audience. I'm leaving plenty of time, so all right, we've got many right in front here.
Hi.
I wonder if thought has been given to the issue.
Oh, we need a mic there, I guess. I want to introduce my chief of staff here, by the way, is Mary Lynn Valinga. Please give her a welcome. You should know. She's also our housing expert, so any tough questions she will take.
All right. Yeah, I'd wondered if thought was given to the problem that these services could be very effective, and the thing is, though, with homelessness, people have no fixed address. If you provide these wonderful services, you're kind of calling people to come to the city to take advantage of them, and there is not enough housing that we can put in any city to provide for all the homeless people who would come here from around the country. And is there any strategy in place to try and offer it to Californians and not to make it a mecca for...
So you're talking about the attractive nuisance theory, which, I guess I want to answer again respectfully. I think it's largely an urban legend with some truth to it. There's some truth to it. I think it's overstated. In our 2019 point-in-time count, we found that 90% of the unsheltered people had been living in the greater Sacramento area for at least a year. And yet I do understand the argument. But, I always say, at least in California, so is it a California versus the rest of the country contrast, or is it a San Francisco, Oakland versus Sacramento contrast? Because if I'm being aggressive about trying to get people indoors, which we are, then, and people are moving up here, well, I know Oakland is being very aggressive about it too, as is San Francisco. So aren't as many people then being attracted from Sacramento to go there? So I like to think that it evens out in some ways. And then the other question is, what choice do we have? I mean, what choice do we have but to try to provide? I know so many people, we get this from some quarters of the business community, want it to be out of sight, out of mind. And I don't know how to achieve that for them or for anybody. Well, number one, these are human beings. They are human beings. And number two, it's not possible. There isn't an island. So we've got to grapple with this and make sure that a fair share sort of policy within our communities and throughout the state is what we insist upon, and that the facilities are operated safely and clean, and that they become a good part of the neighborhood because you're helping move people who are unsheltered from that neighborhood indoors. Does that answer it? No? What are you getting at?
If you had some sort of requirement that someone be in a region, let's say a decade, I mean, of course that's going to be problematic to not offer it to everybody who's there, but saying if you could go to Sacramento and be homeless for a year and then get housing, it seems, I mean, just logically, you're offering something, you're going to create a magnet for
well, what if every city offered the same thing? What if it was
that
a
would be
state
great.
law?
So is there coordination in the state
So
and in the country?
it's a good question. There is no, we've tried the right to housing statewide, and it hasn't gotten a lot of momentum yet. COVID sort of got in the way. The governor's task force, which I co-chaired, recommended a legally enforceable obligation for all cities and counties to meet a specific percentage requirement in terms of shelter and housing. Then COVID hit and kind of lost a little momentum. So at the city, I proposed my own right to housing ordinance, and now a group of business leaders have engaged with me in the city, and we're going to have on the ballot in November, on the city ballot, a requirement, if it passed, that we build shelter equivalent to 60% of the point-in-time count, whatever that is, over the next couple of weeks. We're urging the county of Sacramento to do the same, which is another real fissure point here, and I just got to say this because if you want to know the truth. Cities are not homeless service agencies. We're not mental health agencies. We're not homeless agencies. We are in the game now. It's not a game. We are in the business out of necessity and because it's the right thing to do. We don't do mental health. The counties are the Health and Human Services subdivision of the state. As I joked earlier, if I had written the Prop 63 differently, the cities might have gotten direct allocation, but the counties have all the money. And frankly, there's large surpluses sitting in a lot of county coffers, and we need their help because they're the ones with the expertise around mental health outreach, case management outreach. And so the cultural conflict is that everyone knows their mayor. They don't know their county supervisor. They know the city, right? So I'm the one they love and hate. I accept that. I think it's about 55-45, but who knows? I haven't. And the counties, though, are the ones that actually are legally responsible for helping people with the most severe health and human services conditions. And there is a contradiction. Now, if we had a right to mental health treatment, a legal right, that would be then enforceable, if you will, against the counties. And with care courts, there is a window here to obligate the counties to provide care and service to people that they currently are not serving.
A lot of questions in the back there. Right in the middle. Right there. Perfect.
So I just had, I think the Landerman Act is a really interesting example because you're right that they mandate services, but they don't pay for, nor do they mandate a right to housing. So you're right back where you started around this right to housing. And this back and forth between services and housing, I'm curious, when we think about service systems, we think about people, and when we think about housing systems, we think about like the technical. We just spent a couple hours in that. And so how would you say that the California sort of technical industrial complex of all these people who are invested in sort of the technical side of housing development, how would that need to change to actually then see your right to housing be made a reality?
That's really a great question. I will say that over the last 5+ years that the relationship between the housers, as they call them, and the service providers is better than it was. There used to be, when I was in the legislature, no connection at all. One of the things we did with Prop 63 was that I insisted that we bond against a small percentage of it, and we create a housing bond, $2 billion, called No Place Like Home. It can only be used for people living with serious mental illnesses, which means that by definition the housers have to work with the service providers in order to build a No Place Like Home project. And so what is it going to take? Again, my belief in theory is if there was a right to housing and a right to mental health treatment, that by definition they would have an incentive and in fact be required to work together because all the funding streams would be contingent upon that kind of collaboration. But it takes both. That's another false debate, right? Housing versus services. Get that in my community. Really? First of all, you can't provide the services to people without the housing if you're seriously mentally ill. And if they're seriously mentally ill and all you're providing is housing and not services, they're going to fail in housing. So you need both. I'm sorry, you're right. It's the government agencies. Government itself is still too siloed. That's exactly right. I think, again, Governor Newsom's initiatives are attempting to sort of bridge a lot of those historic gaps between agencies. And it's better, but there's a way to go.
We did have a comment earlier that we could do a full day on governance in homelessness, so we can invite you back for that.
Yeah, yes.
So maybe stay at the same table there, a little bit to the left.
Looking into the future, homelessness is likely to get worse. Homelessness. The trends on AI and automation, the income inequality and poverty is going to get a lot worse than it is now. How are you factoring in this trend and getting ready for the emerging wave on this issue? And how do you develop sustainable solutions around it?
Well, that's why we're here. That is the question. I go back to my initial comment about the state of society and the great economic divide. Because unless that is confronted in a more meaningful way, there's not a way to achieve what you just described. I mean, I think we can do much better at producing housing and being more innovative around housing in the ways we've talked about. But what are we going to do to make sure that young people have career pathways towards higher wage jobs? That's a public education conundrum around whether or not even getting a bachelor's degree these days puts a young person in a position to be able to afford to live in the Bay Area. And so it is going to require, I think, a focus on greater equity in how we build an economy, a modern economy. That's what it's going to take. And housing is a part of that. But housing is, to me, housing is a life essential, but it's also part of the overall ecosystem. So it's got to be everything. I don't have a magic answer. I mean, I know what I'm for. I'm for the right to mental health treatment, right to housing. I also led in the legislature to create a $1.5 billion trust fund for career education for high school students to be able to integrate academic rigor and career application. I believe that we ought to make it easier for people with kids to work by subsidizing childcare, and this is all that goes into allowing people to have a decent life. Housing is an important piece of it, but it's one piece of it. It's essential, but it's one piece.
Maybe time for one final question.
We have this woman here too.
We have two questions, then we'll go here, and then we'll do a lightning round with 5 minutes left.
I saw your hand up there.
You don't need me up here. What the job with the moderator? I've completely failed at even finding the right people.
I hope it's an easy question. Okay. Okay. Go ahead.
So first of all, thank you for coming today. I'm over here.
Hi.
Sorry.
Hi. Sorry. Yeah.
So, do you really think more laws and regulations are going to help? I mean, this is really the problem. Having some new regulation with a court and a judge, really? Have you ever been to court and a judge before? I mean, do you really want them deciding this? Why don't you sponsor a bill getting rid of CEQA? I think that would do a lot more to ending homelessness.
Well, first of all, I don't think getting rid of CEQA is a good idea. I think reforming CEQA, and I participated and led to make some changes, not enough during my tenure, but maybe I can reframe my point, and whether you agree or disagree with me, that's fine too. I believe that some way of forcing government to be accountable for more housing production and caring for the most vulnerable will actually force government to relax their regulations. Because right now, the regulations, NIMBYism, cost, lack of innovation are winning the day. It's easier to say no. And so if there is a non-litigious way to hold government accountable to actually doing what we should be doing at a grander level, I think it'll weaken those regulations that currently stand in the way.
That's a fantasy.
Well, you disagree, but what's your idea, sir? What's your great idea?
My great idea is to have some kind of bill that will significantly change mental health. So something addressing the underlying issue, and a separate bill really changing the ability to build in California. I mean, I think everyone agrees that we should be able to. Yeah, so having a new regulation requiring the government to do something that they can't do according to the current rules and regulations, I mean, it's just more litigation.
I respect your point of view.
Let's go here for the final question.
There we go.
Sorry, I'm a little sleep deprived because I work in mental health. And I'm here from Los Angeles. So born and raised in Sonoma, though. So, okay, so I'm just a little confused because I've been a lifelong Democrat, and I love everything that you said. What confused?
All right, thank you. Oh,
You're not going to like the next part, and that's why I said I should reframe my question after you're really nice. I'm now an independent because here's why. The problem is, at least I only will stay in my lane, right? I'm in Los Angeles. I was a corporate business manager turned therapist turned group homeowner for adults with severe mental illness. Why did I have to change careers? Because there was no place for my brother, who is paranoid schizophrenic with extreme learning disabilities. Literally had to change careers to create an affordable place for my brother to live. In America, that's the reality. So I am on the front lines of this shit, and I'm pissed because you mentioned so many things, and man, if they could be perfected, like, I'm ready. We can solve this. 5150. Do you know how hard it is to get someone 5150'd? I had to do it last week. Sorry, she doesn't have a gun. She's not threatening you. She's in psychosis. She is not with reality. These poor cops, the CARES team that came out, my group homes are in Santa Barbara and LA, they don't want to take them because here's why. We have this overcorrection, it seems like, in California after the closing of the institutions, right? So we've got this overcorrection to we don't want to take anybody's rights away, which is now morphed into neglect.
Yes.
And so here's where I get confused.
I think we agree.
I'm with you. So here's where I get really confused. And I'm sleep deprived, so please remember that.
It's okay. Would you like some coffee?
I've already had 3 cups. For the good of the community, I'm done. Where I get confused, and is it was my former party that put all these damn policies in place. I'm down there talking to the Ventura cops. They call that Bill 949. You know, where someone can walk in and steal $949 worth of goods from CVS and then they just get released? That's not your fault. That's the people, the Democrats in Los Angeles County, allowing this to happen. It's the mentally ill people running around in the streets naked, yelling. It's me calling, because it's in my nice suburban neighborhood in Woodland Hills, Calabasas border, that there is a man screaming, F you, N-word. It takes me 11 minutes to get a cop on the phone, guys. So I will wrap this up by saying, I know it's a very long question. There's too many cooks in the kitchen, right? We need some type of streamlined process, because I can tell you, you apply for SSI, and they send you the mail, and you don't respond within 10 days, you're done, right? They call my client, the person with mental illness, they don't answer the phone, they're done. They need the advocate. So it seems like these deeply rooted problems, but they're actually all these like little areas that if we all just came together and collaborated and were nice to each other, you know, I think that we could really like solve some really real stuff. And I'm not, you know, I'm staying in my lane with housing and mental health, and I really want to get on board with all this. I don't even know what CEQA is, but I'm here because I'm being open-minded and I want to learn about it, and I just feel like I'm genuinely confused why the Democratic Party, the party that was supposed to be of care, has allowed for this level of neglect. That's why I'm really sorry. I've supported Gavin this whole time, but no way, man. It's going to Schellenberger. He's got a good plan, and I actually believe that he can solve it.
I disagree. Sorry.
I know, and I'm glad you still called on me, though. Thank you.
Of course. No. Well, let me. You want me to say, or not?
You've got 1 minute.
No, I think your expression of frustration is right, and it's widely held by so many Californians. I disagree. I think Gavin has actually put more into this than any governor that I've ever worked with. He really has. Billions, and he's trying, through this Care Court proposal, to actually take on the lack of common sense, which says that it's okay for people to be living in squalor out on our streets. So, but at the end of the day, if we don't, as a society, find a way to bring more people indoors and give them the help and the treatment that they need in some compassionate but direct way, then the voters are going to go for something that is probably not wise and that will be way, way out there. So it's incumbent upon us I think to do the right thing and to and to get more people inside and get them the help they need. And that's where I continue to focus. And I do believe that if the law required those who were in charge to do more of that, that we would get more people indoors and more people treated. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mayor.
Thanks, man.
We made it.